Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you Barbara and Gulshin for working behind the scenes, and Barbara for the very kind invitation to come and speak at this conference. I noticed that there's a lot of exciting discussion happening within the room, but what we've not done, I don't think, collectively, is marshalled the Twitter account for the contested Kinship conference. So I thought I'd give it a plug, and it's at @C_Kinship. So do feel free to engage, obviously, in this space, but more broadly, because it might be a really nice legacy for the conference organisers to have that wider debate in the more public sphere. Okay, I'm going to focus on talking about the Critical Kinship Studies book that I wrote with my good friend and colleague Damien Riggs. Damien's based at Flinders University in Australia, and I know that he's currently on holiday with two of his 5 children in Tasmania, so I'm sending him positive vibes for a wonderful holiday as I'm giving this talk to you today. Certainly you can tweet if you wish around this talk, but can I just say not slides 5 to 7, because I'm going to embed a bit of personal story around kinship within the wider talk today. So I think it's fair to say that studies of Western kinship have increasingly sought to critique the normative assumptions that often underpin how caring relationships between humans are understood. So what I'm going to try and do within this talk is draw together a range of different stories, kinship stories that are intended to jar. So they're quite deliberately incongruous and incongruent. And I'm going to do that for a particular purpose. In that, we think that a critical studies of kinship needs to decenter humans in its focus on kinship. So by doing that, we can highlight where the boundaries are drawn about what constitutes human kinship and examine how understandings of human kinship are always predetermined in relation to other species. We're really not as special as we think we are. And what I'm going to do is apply this hopefully critical lens to focus on a number of different areas. I want to talk a little bit about loss, because I think we think that that's foundational to understanding familial and kin relationships. I want to talk a little bit about motherhood and recognition and who kind of falls from the category of mother. And I'm going to touch on a few aspects of cross-kinship and cross-species kinship, and a little bit, if it's not too self-indulgent, about my own life. And in doing so, I want us to call into question the taken for granted boundaries that often limit how we think about family. And it's interesting to consider how kinship's naturalised. So I'm going to start by talking about a children's picture book. Now, King and King and Family by De Haan and Nijland, Dutch authors, published in 2004, is the sequel to the author's first book. Has anybody read this book? Yeah, the odd nod. The first book, which was King and King, was praised for its sensitivity and endearing depiction of a prince who is looking to find someone to marry, culminating in him meeting another prince who he marries, and they both become kings. The first book also met with considerable controversy. A number of American states, for example, tried to ban the book. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, this sequel, King and Family, has met with very little controversy. Surprising not because such a book should be met with controversy, but because the sequel tells the story of the two kings welcoming a child into their family. But of course, there's no pictures of kissing in this book, as there was in the first. So why is King and Family interesting to a critical kinship studies? Gay parenting and the responses to the first book, homophobia, moral panics? I would say no. It's actually the particular ways that it represents kinship. It depicts kinship through characters who would typically be considered marginal, i.e. gay men, but importantly, it demonstrates the naturalisation of kinship as a dominant trope or indeed perhaps a founding logic of Western societies, is suitably flexible. It's flexible enough to encompass all forms of so-called family diversity. We heard of rainbow families yesterday, and I would couch that within this frame. So Western kinship categories, as they're normatively understood, are fluid enough to incorporate gay male parents into a standardised narrative precisely because kinship as a technology serves to locate itself within nature, i.e. it's naturalised. So I'll tell you a little bit about the book. The book opens with the two kings leaving for their honeymoon to a land far from their kingdom. From the first page then, notions of home and away, familiar and strange are evoked. A fear of the strange is voiced by King Bertie on the second page, where he says, "I must admit, I'm a little worried about the jungle animals." A statement he makes to King Lee, who is holding a book entitled Exciting Wildlife by D. Ainger. Here then, difference becomes a source of fear, a source of potential danger. When they arrive at their destination, however, they find that their unusually heavy suitcase contains Crown Kitty, their cat. I'm glad to see other people thought we were starting at 9:30 as well, not just me. Welcome, sit down. We've not got very far as yet. The strange is therefore neutralised by her familiar presence. Once the party of three leave for their hike through the jungle, they encounter a range of animals through which again the strange is made familiar through the operations of anthropomorphism. So for example, we see birds who are feeding a worm to a baby bird referred to as such good parents. Potentially radically different represented wildlife is domesticated through the human language of kinship. So the human language of kinship can so readily incorporate wildlife, animals who had previously been represented in a fearful way. The kings continue to enjoy their holiday, though they're concerned that they're being watched or followed. On the last night of their holiday, King Bertie sighs, "All those animals with their babies, I wish we had a little one of our own," evoking a standard developmentalist logic in which humans grow up, they get married, and they have children. And in so doing, they extend the same developmental logic and indeed desire to non-human animals. Of course, when they arrive home, their suitcase is again unusually heavy, though this time it's because there's a little girl from the jungle to whom King Lee and King Bertie state, "You're the child we've always wanted." Here again, in both the surprise arrival of the child and their envelopment in a standard narrative in which she is the child the two kings have always wanted, difference is again assimilated into a logic of the same. While at the start of the story, the country to which the kings travel is depicted as wild and something to worry about, by the end of the book, these concerns are gone, with the little girl depicted as able to share her stories with the two kings, using presumably the same language, and where she's given a name that arguably reflects the culture of the kings, perhaps less so her own. Her adoption seals the deal, and this is fast, it is smooth, it is unproblematic, wrapping the new princess in the logic of sameness in which the ever-expansive Western narrative of kinship is able to incorporate any difference. So that's an opening story. Now, King and Family is not simply a story about gay parenting, nor is it simply an example of the domestication of gay parenting into a standard developmental logic that invokes an incremental rites of passage narrative. Rather, it's also a story in which human kinship norms are able to encompass and indeed domesticate animal kinship practices. Furthermore, it's a story in which difference is assimilated into a logic of sameness, cross-culturally, cross-species, and unregulated across borders. So, what we suggest is the aim of a critical kinship studies is to examine practices of naturalisation and to think of kinship as a technology rather than as a taken for granted social structure. and to think about the human, explicitly the human, in human kinship in ways that destabilise the centrality of humanism within kinship studies. That's our suggestion. And in terms of post-humanism, as a theoretical orientation underpinning the critical kinship studies, that allows us to examine the construction of human kinship practices and to examine who such practices exclude, both some humans and all non-human species, and to identify the ways in which such practices are naturalised. So, in this notion of critical kinship studies that Damien and I expound, the incorporation of what is considered nature into what is referred to as culture is a common theme, and it's something that we keep referring to throughout this particular book. And of course, culture is naturalised in ways that make it appear predetermined. There's nothing new or indeed original about that thought, and many people prior to us have said very similar things. And we argue that concerns about incorporation and naturalisation sit at the very heart of critical kinship studies as we understand it. So the aim then is to examine practices of naturalisation, to think of kinship as a technology rather than a taken for granted social structure, and to think about the human, which destabilises the centrality of humanism within critical kinship studies. So, what I want to do today, as I intimated, is to talk a little bit about which humans matter, because it's not all humans within this landscape, how particular normative categories such as things like the maternal are reserved for particular groups of people, and how people can fall from or indeed be actively excluded from such categories. And then I'm going to touch on cross-species kinship, and I couldn't end without, I've kind of sort of shoved a bit about Brexit in. It doesn't really fit, but you know, as I think the only British-based Brit at this conference, it would be very, very remiss of me if I didn't make some mention of the absolute lunacy that Britain is about to embark on, or may not. We'll see in a fortnight's time. We've been living in a permanently liminal state for some years now, and hugely embarrassingly so, I have to say. So I want to talk a little bit about aspects of my marginal kinship, and marginal in a, you know, there are aspects of my own understanding of kinship which are hugely privileged and not in fact marginal at all. So again, you know, it's a relative concept in relation to these things. But I drew this little diagram a few days ago, in part because I wanted my daughter to do something similar as well. So I'm going to talk you through it, and I'm aware, reflecting on it, that it's incredibly, you know, there are no friends in this little diagram, and there are friends, obviously, that all of us engage with who are very much part of what we consider to be our own kinship networks, but they're not in here. So there's me in one triangle, and then there's a little line back and forth to W, and that's my wife. We were married in 2006 in Canada at a time where marriage wasn't legal in the UK. We were about 8 months into civil partnership at that particular time. For the lawyers in the room, we got married at a point where actually you had to be resident in Canada in order to be able to get divorced. Now, my wife's a legal academic, which I think was really rather quite cunning at that moment in time, because we would have had to have gone and lived in Canada if I'd decided that I didn't want to, you know, carry on being married to her. And we have a child. The little bit there, the first was my first pregnancy, which ended in a loss, and you can see I did a big circle, and then I kind of thought better of it and thought, no, is this as significant part of my life now as it was then? And I thought, well, no. So I kind of rubbed it out and made it a little bit smaller, but it's, you know, it's still very much there. And then in the middle, we've got a dog, a cat, and a dog. That's what the DCD stands for. And they're very much kind of embedded in the heart of our kind of kinship network. And then this mum at the top is my biological mother, who is one of these supremely brilliant, solid mothers. And there's a kind of a dotted line back and forth to my wife, in part because my wife's own mother died when she was 9, and my mother is incredibly important to her, and they've got an incredibly strong relationship, really. And then in this kind of cloud-like element is my dad. And I looked at this again, I thought, well, why did I put my dad and my mum together? Because they split up when I was about 16. Why have I put them in this co-located position? And we can see the image on the bottom left is my daughter. She's about 15 months old here, and she sat on my dad's knee. So my dad there is about 60, well, he is 65. He's been living with younger onset Alzheimer's disease for about 9 years. He's in a care home, and you can see the look on this little 1-year-old's face of kind of puzzlement and kind of lack of comprehension. So I took the photo, and she's actually looking to my mother in that image. And that was entirely common for my father. He wasn't able to engage at all verbally or socially or make eye contact for about 5 years when he was in a nursing home environment. And you can see here, I mean, that's quite I think it's quite a powerful image, it's quite a poignant image, but it shows that, you know, the people talk a lot about role reversal in the context of dementia, and I think this really does kind of underscore, you know, the very profound limitations that dementia can have. And in the context of a grandfather-granddaughter interaction, it's completely antithetical to what we would imagine happening in those kinds of interactions between grandparents and young children. So that's the image on the left. The image on the right is our 8-year-old with 2 of our animal companions, and very much there's this kind of, you know, kind of pseudo sibling relationship that happens within our family in relation to particularly the dogs, but also the cat as well. And certainly the older dog, the one in the background who predates the child, I remember we got in a pet behaviourist on the run up to having the kid, because he's a bit high maintenance, this dog. He's a cross between a border collie and a terrier, which is not, it's not like a labradoodle. It's not a cross that's going to ever catch on, really. So he's a bit too bright for his own good, this dog. And we were kind of, you know, worrying about how he was going to cope with, you know, bringing a small human into the pack, as it were. So we had a behaviourist, and I mean, looking back on it, it was really quite farcical. So there was me with an empty buggy and the dog and my partner walking around the local streets to try and familiarise the dog with the business of having a baby in a pushchair. So we brought the baby home, and, you know, he sniffed her and kind of went, you know, new pack member, and it was fine, absolutely fine. But him particularly has been a really important part of her life. And, you know, I remember, you know, learning to stand, and she'd grab 2 fistfuls of hair on the dog's back and sort of pull herself up to standing. And again, you'd think, you know, any right-thinking animal would think, it's a small human, get off me. But he would, you know, look round and go, oh, okay, it's, you know, it's you again. The one that displaced me as being, you know, the central point of connection within this family structure. So that's a, you know, a bit about my kind of local context, and I do it not to foreground that necessarily, but to highlight a few things. So one is around loss, and I'm going to talk a little bit more around that. And I think it speaks a little bit to what Christine was saying yesterday about Halberstam's emphasis on failure. It's not something really within you know, queer kinship or non-normative family forms that's really had a lot of space to be voiced for very good reason. You know, if people have precarious, you know, legal rights and legal statuses, it's not really going to create a frame where that kind of thing can be talked about in a public forum. And indeed, my lovely feminist anthropologist colleague, who's based in the US, Krista Craven, she's just produced a book on reproductive losses, challenges in LGBTQ family making, which is a really powerful anthropological account looking at both adoption and reproductive losses through her ethnographic work. So I would highly recommend that to you. So all of this is a way into saying, so I said to my daughter a couple of days ago, I said, I'm going to Germany and I'm going to do a talk about families. So, okay. Would you draw for me on a piece of paper? Would you draw me what you think of as your family? And she said, yeah, okay then. And she said to me, do you want a dad or two mums? And I said, well, I want you to draw your family. So again, I mean, that underscores the normative structure that's embedded for kids. So away she went with a piece of paper. And she drew me and her mama, she drew the dogs, and then she stopped. The dogs, sorry, and the cat. And then she stopped. And I said, do you want to carry on or are you stopping there? It's, you know, it's up to you. You can carry on if you wish. So she drew a circle and then she wrote, and she said, at home family? And I was like, yeah, that's fine if you want to define it like that. And then down this side here, so we've got Finn, Brodie, Elliot, Esme. They're her 4 cousins that are her mama's sister's kids. So Auntie Vicky and Uncle Lee. Auntie, she's got dyslexia, hence the creative spelling sometimes. But so we've got her mama's sister and her husband. Then she drew Michael down here. Now, Michael is the person who provided the other half of her gametes. So there's no kin relationship here as such, but you know they know each other, and Michael's a very good friend of both of ours. So there he is. And then she drew Granny Beth. Now, Granny Beth is Michael's mother, who claims a kin relationship, and you know we're perfectly open to that. In relation to Martha. And then she drew my sister's Auntie Katie, and those are her 2 kids and her husband there at the bottom. And then she stopped. And I said, well, what about Nana? I felt slightly, you know, perturbed that she'd not mentioned my, you know, brilliant mother who does lots of childcare for us. And, you know, we'd just been on holiday with. She said, Nana! And then she put Nana in. And then we stopped. And then my wife walks in and she said, oh, well, where's the rest of my family then? So the point is, you know, these kinds of constructions of what family are, they're not static, they're not monolithic, they're multiple. And, you know, if I've asked her to do this at a different time on a different day, we may well have generated a different kind of representation. And within this kind of space, I would urge you, if you have a moment, to think this through for yourselves, because it's interesting to reflect on these things. And certainly people like Fiona Tasker and developmental psychologists use this as a way of kind of getting particularly younger children to think through what kinship is. But, you know, why should it be the preserve of younger children? You know, it's something that we can all, you know, think about and engage in. So I'm going to move on now to think about which humans matter and talk a little bit more about loss. So what we say in the book is that kinship is implicitly and explicitly produced through and by different, typically often privileged and rather narrow forms of connection, through presence rather than absence, and by contrast, we would emphasise that loss and absence are fundamental to notions of what a critical kinship studies is and does. So that's the kind of claim that we stake out. And there are a few interesting images in this slide. So the image at the top, which is not an easy image to see, and I have permission from the research participant to show this image. That's one of the participants in the project that I did on lesbian and bisexual women's experiences of pregnancy loss with her stillborn baby. And the image at the bottom is from Krista, who I've mentioned, her ethnographic work. And it's an image of a family where Derek, who loves to read, and Oren, who would have. So it's a library box of a queer family that's memorialising the child that they didn't have. When we think about kinship and loss, personhood's routinely denied in the context of certain forms of losses. So the loss of a companion animal, and in the case of pregnancy loss, to name just two of those. While in others, only certain forms of personhood are valued. So when children are diagnosed with autism or are transgender, for example. So what we do in the book is we put together different forms of loss, and we discuss pregnancy loss, this kind of loss of possibilities for especially motherhood that goes with it. But we also discuss narratives of loss associated and amongst parents of trans children and loss associated with autism diagnosis. So, you know, pregnancy loss, reproductive loss, adoptive loss, and loss of animal companions they're just less socially sanctioned forms of grief. We don't have the frameworks, the rites of passage, the ways of memorialising those things that we do in relation to other forms of more socially sanctioned loss and grief. So just to kind of summarise, you know, the whole of the pregnancy loss literature, and this is from Hackett and Renner. They say a large body of literature reveals that women who have miscarried report friends and family responding in ways that reduce or deny the importance of the event, leaving the grieving woman with little sense of support. In addition, the experiences reported by these women are quite different from those reported by individuals who have experienced other types of loss, e.g. spouse or parent. For example, others rarely respond to the loss of a partner or spouse with the statement, "You can have another." Yet this is a common response to a woman who has had a miscarriage. So the idea that one person is replaceable with another it's replete across both lay understandings of pregnancy loss and the loss of companion animals, as exemplified in films and television programmes where those who've experienced either form of loss are encouraged to try again or to get another companion animal. And what falls to the wayside in these types of responses are the dreams, the experiences, and indeed the kinship that may be experienced prior to the loss, and which for many people can't simply be replaced by another pregnancy or companion animal. And I want to quote from an Australian heterosexual woman who talks about the personhood associated with her with a pregnancy, and also the loss of control and of possibilities. So this is a quote from Maria. She says, "I think from the first moment I saw her on the ultrasound, I knew her. And I also felt like I knew who she was going to become. She moved when I played certain music or watched certain movies. So I felt already that I knew what interests she would have. So the loss has been profound. I've lost the person I thought she would be. And I know it's all just what I made of a whole lot of little things, but that doesn't change the fact that she felt like a person to me. Of course, the problem is that the idea of what she was going to be was all mine. And so there's no one else who knew her like I did, so no one else who understands the loss." And this kind of discussion around loss from the pregnant woman, the pregnant person, is very, very, very common. Now, in what we're trying to do is we put together this pregnancy loss kind of perspective with narratives of loss amongst parents who've got a trans child. So this is a different kind of lens to look through this. So this is a quote from Brill and Pepper's book, and what they say, and they're characterising the entirety of this experience here. The grief that parents raising gender variant and transgender children experience falls into two distinct categories. The first is the grief over lost dreams for your child. The second is the grief that parents of transgender children feel for the child who goes away in order for the new one to emerge. Perhaps the most painful part of the process of accepting your child is letting go of the fantasies you held for your child, and also the fantasies of what you were going to share together in the future. So in this particular quote, grief is treated as a taken for granted fact, rather than one possible response from a whole spectrum. Further, the idea that a transgender child causes lost dreams and the need to let go of fantasies reinforces the idea that all parents will have particular gendered dreams for their children, dreams that are gender normative and hence are invariably dashed when a child is not normatively gendered. And it seems to us somewhat over-determined to presume that all parents will share this viewpoint and therefore that all parents will experience a transgender child as a loss. But that's certainly how it's positioned in the self-help and the wider literature. So here's a quote from a woman, Mariam, in Perlman's 2012 book. She says, "Even though I suspected, I was so shocked. It was so foreign, so weird. I guess I kind of cracked up. I couldn't feel worse if she died. It was a horrible way to feel, all my hopes and expectations gone. I can't seem to make peace with it. All those weddings, all those showers, me being a grandmother, I feel ripped off." So this is in relation to her trans son. So for these mothers, a transgender child represents the death of dreams or the loss of hopes and expectations. To a certain extent, these mothers and other parents like them acknowledge that they were their dreams and not their child's dreams. Nonetheless, there's a sense in which the loss of their dreams is viewed as something that their child is subjecting them to rather than their loss being of their own making, albeit a making that's framed by culturally normative assumptions about a presumed relationship between sex and gender. Also, the analogy between a child being transgender and death. This is an extreme case formulation that highlights how intending parents' dreams are tied to assumptions about the particular forms of personhood that a child will display. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about loss. I'm now going to talk a bit about the maternal and motherhood and recognition. So Reynolds summarises this in their paper, What is Maternal Studies? So they say maternal studies seek to critically investigate and provide a theoretical framework to the variety of perspectives on mothering. Pivotal to this study is the belief that mothering is a set of socially constructed activities and relationships which are positioned and contextualised within social, historical and cultural frameworks. Nothing hugely radical or contested here, I don't think. But certainly motherhood, the maternal, I would say is pivotal to an understanding of kinship. So what we do is put together research on transgendered mothers and cisgender women living with a dementia. Again, not categories of the maternal that you would generally think of necessarily or consider side by side. And what we do is we analyse primary and secondary data. So we've got first-person narratives of adult children of transgender women and first-person narratives of adult children of cisgender women living with a dementia. So in terms of thinking about the maternal and kind of building on Reynolds, it's interesting to think, well, what are some of these social, historical and cultural frameworks pertinent to critical kinship studies? And we suggest these, and I'm sure there are many other elements of this. We suggest that cisgenderism is part of that landscape, as is biological essentialism, ableism and binaries of adult child that are often drawn quite sharply. So if we use these as kind of tools or lenses or frameworks, we can start to see who and what is recognised as maternal and which mothers kind of slip from or are elided by these understandings of maternal. And we frame this by just drawing on one example, and we talk about Angelina Jolie's story just as a as an exemplar, really, a useful example of how motherhood is normatively constructed as being around for one's children for as long as possible, and how being a mother involves, as it's normatively produced, both conceiving and birthing children. Now, in 2013 and 15, Angelina Jolie wrote for the New York Times about her experiences of a prophylactic double mastectomy and a prophylactic oophorectomy because of a family history of cancer and because she has the BRCA1 gene, which is associated with breast cancer. So hers is a useful story when considering mothering and womanhood. So she talks in these pieces for the New York Times about a kind of an injunction not to die, and it's explicitly framed within respect to the loss of her own mother at age 56, which is implicitly depicted as not part of the natural order of things, and in the light of her own children's possible loss of her as a mother. So she refers to the BRCA1 as a faulty gene, which positions cancer as something to be corrected, thus ensuring a natural order of things, i.e. where mothers are expected to live into old age. This logic of longevity is not simply an example of human exceptionalism, but it's also evidence of the privileged location of a particular white woman and mother for whom longevity is a naturalised priority and something that she can afford to invest in. So Jolie is the agentic Western citizen. Having identified that she has the BRCA1 gene, she then decided to be proactive. That's her words. And importantly, as Jolie is at pains to emphasise, this decision and the removal of her breast in no way minimises her role as a woman nor as a mother. So she frames her subsequent reconstruction with reference to her children, emphasising that it's reassuring, and I'm quoting, it's reassuring that they see nothing that makes them uncomfortable. They can see my small scars and that's it. Everything else is just mommy, the same as she always was. So being a mother then involves not making one's children uncomfortable. It requires being the same as one always was. And as such, while Jolie suggests that her decision to have a prophylactic mastectomy was empowering, to be empowered by this definition is to be just the same post-surgery, which would suggest is both a narrative of privilege as well as being a narrative of that endorses a very particular and narrow image of what motherhood is. So that's an exemplar of the normative. The more marginal comes from the discussion of transgender parenting and mothers living with a dementia. So just to very, very briefly summarise, previous research, generally the category of transgender parents fails to attend to transgender mothers as a particular category. And within this, a handful of studies suggest that transgender women claim or intend to claim the category of mother. So they either do or post-transition, pre-transition, they claim that they will. And other studies suggest that some women accept their child's determination, i.e. if they insist upon using dad or a first name, and that this can be experienced as invalidating and have significant consequences. So that's the background around transgender parenting. If we compare and contrast that to previous research on motherhood and dementia, I mean, it's worth kind of setting dementia in context. I'm just in the process of reading a memoir by Wendy Mitchell. It's called Somebody I Used to Know, and I highly, highly recommend it. This is a woman who is living with younger onset Alzheimer's, and it's a really fascinating account of what it's like to live with a dementia. But also there's some really interesting references to kinship within the book. So she's a single mother and she's got 2 daughters. And the way within this narrative she accounts for trying to retain being a mother and resisting this idea that they're going to become her carers is just really, really, really interesting. So I highly recommend that. So when we look at the literature around dementia historically, dementias are generally seen as invalidating. So there's this idea that came from Sweeting and Gilhooly's work some decades ago around dementia being a form of social death. So the person with a dementia diagnosis is a liminal or non-person who's demonstrably making the transition from life to death. So it's an incredibly othering kind of diagnosis and an othering experience. Having said that, and also it's a gendered experience as well, I should say. So dementias disproportionately affect women, and of course if we think about the intersections of the maternal and gendered norms, research that suggests that the transition in identity brought on by dementia may be especially troubling for women who are mothers. And I think, you know, the account that Wendy Mitchell provides in Somebody I Used to Know is you know, bears testament to that, actually. However, we have seen in recent years a move from a discourse of dementia sufferer through to a more self-advocacy kind of discourse around dementia survivor. So people like Christine Broaden, who's an Australian writer, done a lot of good work trying to, you know, counter the dominant narrative around dementia as decline and suffering. But you know, retaining pre-dementia identities and independence can be hugely challenging for people with a dementia. And there are challenges linked to adapting to changing needs as dementia invariably progresses, and the inevitable relinquishing of roles and tasks and indeed status within the family. So, as I say, we draw on these two kinds of data. One is narratives in the media and personal writing, so it's kind of self-help and personal accounts of experiences of transgender women and their adult children. And I'm just going to talk about the children's narratives, and interviews or focus groups with people caring for a parent, of whom 9 were caring for a mother. So if I just delve straight into the data from children of transgender women. So Howie says, names like pronouns had always been a challenge for us. This conundrum might have been solved by defaulting her title to mother, as most children of transsexual people are inclined to do. Call us old-fashioned, but my father and I had little intention of altering the name of our relationship, regardless of peer pressure. I already had a mother who was a bit proprietary about the title, and rightfully so, as she had virtually raised me solo. Also, I had a father. She might have changed her gender, but that didn't change who originally brought the sperm to the party. It also seemed unlikely that I would ever adjust to calling her Chris. No matter how liberal we were, I couldn't deal with abdicating title entirely. After obtaining no help whatsoever from the thesaurus, I shortened and softened my father's appellation to Dar, not as frontier woodsman-esque as Pa, and not as baggage-laden as Dad, but still fatherly all the same. So this is, I think, an interesting account of the kind of the boundaries and the slippage and the negotiation around some of these categories. And here's another account. In public, we became adept at blowing pronouns. Today, I still slip up sometimes and call Dana he or him, but back then we did it on purpose to show Dana that we still thought of her as a man, a husband and father, not this strange new woman who wore frilly fancy sweatsuits and pink lipstick and who spoke in an artificial sounding falsetto. Every time my mother or I said he or him in public, Dana would respond with a dirty look, an elbow in the ribs or a kick under the table. But being corrected in public just made me angrier, and I would keep calling him Dana him. Okay, so this is, again, an interesting account in terms of how the category of a transgender mother can be, people can be pushed from that category by family members in particular context. And, you know, it's not a short hop, I don't think, for us to label this type of account as a transphobic kind of account around trans motherhood. Oh. Brilliant, thank you. So let's contrast this to cisgender, the accounts of children of cisgender women with dementia. So Davis says, Mum was a rather dominant character and very loving. She was a worrier, especially about her children. Mum hated staying in during the day, and once she'd retired, she went out into town every day, come rain or shine. I find myself writing in the past tense. Although Mum is still living, dementia is such a dreadful disease, rendering the sufferer childlike, but a baby can cry when hungry or thirsty. Mum can't. So there's a prevalent discourse, as I've said, manifest in both lay accounts of dementia care and in the literature, that those with dementia become more childlike. And there are other instances of this notion of kind of reconfiguring normative familial relationships, and it's evident in lots of different personal accounts. So this comes from a piece in an anthology from Jennifer Davis, who is entitled "We Don't Know What's Going Through Her Mind." So it's, you know, it's projecting onto the person with dementia, you know, various things, but the childlike and dependent nature of that, and the not being the mother that she was comes through very, very strongly. The next example I've got is from a focus group data. So this is from James. And he says, strange to say, even though she wouldn't recognise me as her son, deep down there was something there, because I was the one person she would be most at ease with. It's probably the best way I can put it. But it got to the stage whereby, for example, my mum would see my car at the front drive and say, oh, my boyfriend is here, my boyfriend is here. The first time this happened, I thought, oh, what do I do now? So I decided to change my clothes, my top and trousers, and suddenly I was her boyfriend. And this went on for quite a few months, and it was not just once a day. Every time she saw my car, it might be 4, 5, 6 times a day. So here, James is recounting engaging in role play with his mother in order to maintain her reality that he was her boyfriend rather than her son. So, you know, we can see, you know, a fracturing and a reconfiguring of familial relationships. Now, while the use of deception on both sides has been described with respect to mothers and daughters, it's interesting in James's case that by actively engaging in his mother's reality and rationalising the situation as a compliment, this reportedly circumvents any upset, distress or agitation on his mother's part. Now, if we look at motherhood and dementia, these kinds of issues were reflected in my interview data with both daughters and sons. Sue, for example, discussed how resistive her mother was to hands-on care from her. So she says, the hands-on caring, she was awful. I didn't do anything right. Don't treat me like a baby. And you know, it's very difficult to get it right, isn't it? She was doing things which, I can walk, I'm not an invalid. The path from independence to dependence. For us as a family, perhaps not for the professionals because she'll take it from them, but for the family, it's been really difficult. So we can see how challenged her mother's perception of herself as competent and capable was by the path from independence to dependence. And through her active voicing, Sue offers an evocative account, I think, of her mother's perspective about accepting care from her daughter, a perspective which is actively challenging being infantilized don't treat me like a baby, and being invalidated. I'm not an invalid. And noticeably, this projectable ending, she was doing things which maybe were unsafe or were putting her at risk, is unvoiced by Sue. Arguably, because Sue is attending to a hearably positioning her mother as childlike. It's something that we're attentive to, and we manage that, even though there's this prevalent cultural discourse which positions people with dementia as becoming increasingly more childlike. There's another quote here from, this is actually from an Alzheimer's research charity publicity campaign, which I think illustrates this kind of assemblage of impaired affect and this kind of broad sequential change in kinship relationships, and a mother actually being sort of refolded into the fabric of the family logic in a childlike position. So Liz Allen says, although mum has no emotional attachment to her grandchildren, my sister's two kids are almost developing at the same rate as she is, albeit forward in time rather than backwards. And in many ways, we treat all three of them in a similar way. So this quote from the daughter also speaks to what writers like Topher and colleagues term the good mother representation. So in their work, they discuss how the normative demands of mothering and motherhood position the woman caregiver as the ever-present mother. And this lens that they suggest may help to explain why many female dementia caregivers subordinate their own needs and shoulder the whole burden of care and ultimately run the risk of overexerting themselves. They argue that the cultural model of intensive mothering bleeds through and is projected into the dementia caregiving role. Okay, so what I want to do now is maybe see or provide some examples of where the boundaries of kinship might lie, particularly in the context of video data that I've got based on memory clinic interactions. So if we think about kinship in a particular institutional context, kinship is enacted and highly dependent on the context in which it's performed. So going back to that notion of performing kinship. And that's both at sort of a broad discursive level, but also by the moment-by-moment unfolding within the interaction. So at a more micro level, I guess. So in this sense, kinship is dynamic and contingent on the context. So I want to talk about and illustrate about how the boundaries of kinship are played out in ways that kind of re-embed normative ways of doing family. And again, it's the dementia care context and it's memory clinic interaction. So what I would suggest is that kinship it's indexively relevant. It's a discursive resource that can be marshalled for a whole range of different purposes. And it's quite interesting, I think, to interrogate where and when familial relationships come into play or not, and the status that they have or don't have. And I think a site like memory clinic interaction is an interesting one, given that it's not dyadic medical interaction. It's normatively, there's at least one other person in the room with the person that has the dementia diagnosis or is seeking the dementia diagnosis. So it's triadic or wider kind of interaction. So in the example I'm about to show you, Pete, who's a recently retired teacher, is visiting the memory clinic for the first time on his own. Now that in and of itself is unusual. People tend to go with supporting others into these frightening kind of social contexts. And he discusses worrying about his memory, and he provides numerous examples. So he says things like, it's like names of people that I worked with only 4 years ago. I think, what on earth was their name? And it's totally gone. And then towards the end of the appointment, the clinician invokes Pete's wife So the clinician says, so it's very important to you and your wife, and I'm aware that things are not quite what they used to be. And I take it that Justine, Pete's wife, although she's only 1 year younger than you, is still functioning a bit better in these things. So it's interesting to contrast that the contrast with Justine's putative functioning is inserted into this interaction. And ultimately, this appointment concludes with a referral for Pete to have a brain scan to see what it shows. And this referral is predicated less on Pete's cognitive performance, so the doctor says you're performing pretty well on the tests, and actually more on his account of his wife's concern and the doctor's perspective that your wife is very important. So this is not a co-present person. This is invoked through Pete's account of his wife's perspective on his abilities. Now, earlier in the appointment, Pete reports that Justine will say, your memory's getting worse, you're forgetting things. And it was really my wife's prompting that brought me. So, and we know, I mean, this kind of spousal push for engagement in health services is highly typical in a heteronormative relational context. And for men, you know, it's omnipresent in this particular clinical appointment. Now, the question is, would a non-present same-sex spouse or a friend or a neighbour have the same significant impact in shaping the trajectory of this type of medical interaction? And I've got one example from my data set in this regard. So Sal is accompanying Beryl, who had a range of different comorbidities, including dementia. Beryl's with her husband George. They're both in their 80s, and Sal is coming to them to the clinic appointment. Sal's characterised by George as like the very, very best daughter we could have just across the road. So basically she's a neighbour. And we can see the boundaries of kinship being drawn rather differently in this exchange between the doctor and Sal. And she's got some changes, like small stroke disease in the brain. Oh, I didn't know that. Well, that's what the brain scan showed, you see. So she's got that. So if I was her daughter, how would I know, you see? Well, yeah. You know, it's, you know, I don't know how far to. No, you're right. Now, much of this exchange is implicit. It's news to Sal that Beryl has vascular dementia, and her lack of knowledge of this significant information is indexedly linked to kinship. So she says, so if I was her daughter, in that she's suggesting that if she were closer to Beryl or knew her history more, she would be noticing more signs of cognitive impairment. Although George frames Sal as the very best daughter, this exchange suggests that Sal is aware that her normatively accorded position is kith rather than kin in the context of the clinic. And this forces her to make a concession, i.e. to say, if I was her daughter. Her expressed lack of certainty, about where to draw the boundary in her relationship with Beryl and George, I don't know how far to, and she cuts off, is confirmed by the doctor. And interestingly, this doesn't signal a lack of medical comment on the nature and status of people's relationships in the clinic. When we saw in the case of Pete's example, and this is the same medical professional, the wife was unequivocally positioned as very important. So you know, we can see the dynamics of how relationships get played out in institutional contexts. Okay, I'm running out of time. Am I running out of time? Okay, all right. Well, I'll trot through the last 10 minutes then.
Well, we have also time for a discussion, but of course we started later, so
yes.
That's actually fine. It's so fascinating. So
Okay. Thank you.
That's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to talk lastly a little bit about cross-species kinship. And I mentioned earlier on that a post-humanist critical kinship studies takes as one of its foci the everyday ways in which Western human kinship practices are naturalised through both implicit and explicit comparison with non-human animals. Implicit comparisons are the basis of humanism itself, the privileging of human accounts over all others. This is something of a constant, shaping the actions of most humans living in Western societies in the sense of being relatively unaware of anthropocentrism that shapes our worldviews. I'm going to talk again about a children's picture book. And, you know, I mean, And Tango Makes 3 was published in 2005, and you know, I was thinking, oh, you know, this is all a bit dated, you know, these kinds of issues aren't contentious or controversial anymore. And then I was reminded that just in January this year, there's a programme in British primary schools at the moment called No Outsiders, and it's a series of lessons to introduce young kids to the different aspect of equalities legislation. So part of that is around diverse families. And there was a petition signed by 400 parents of a school in Birmingham objecting to the provision of this curriculum in schools. So it is live and it is still contentious. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this story. So this book has been in the centre of considerable controversy. Between 2006 and 2008, and again in 2010, the book topped a list of the most complained about books in the United States and was the most banned book for several years. And across these years, complaints came from at least 6 American states, primarily from parents who felt that the subject matter of the book was inappropriate for young readers. In 2014, the National Library Board of Singapore announced its intention to destroy copies. This plan was subsequently overturned on protest, but the book is shelved in the adult section of the library. So why the controversy over a children's picture book? Those who oppose the book object to the fact that it tells the story of 2 male chin-strap penguins housed in New York's Central Park Zoo, and more specifically that the story depicts the penguins as a couple who hatch an egg and raise the baby penguin. Opponents of the book, perhaps predictably, view the book as promoting homosexuality, as endorsing gay parenting, and as addressing sexuality-related topics that they consider too sensitive for young readers. Conversely, those who celebrate the book emphasise the fact that the book is based on 2 male penguins who are actually housed in the Central Park Zoo. These 2 penguins, according to their keeper, Rob Gramsey, did partner off and were subsequently given an egg from another pair of penguins, which they did then hatch, feed and raise. The 2 male penguins were named Roy and Silo, and the names that are used in the book, and the baby penguin born to them was named Tango, hence the title of the book. Now, while the controversy over the book is useful to a certain extent in the context of critical kinship studies, i.e. to examine social norms about sexuality and family shape responses to the book, a quote from a co-author of the book, Justin Richardson, highlights more precisely the reasons why we focus on the book. So Richardson states that we wrote the book to help parents teach children about same-sex families. It's no more an argument in favour of human gay relationships than it is a call for children to swallow their fish whole or sleep on rocks. Now, leaving aside the contradictory claim that the book aims to teach children about same-sex families, but it's not an argument in favour of human gay relationships, what we're left with in this quote is a concern that goes to the very heart of our account of what constitutes critical kinship studies. That is, the ways in which other species are at best addressed in terms of kinship through the operations of anthropomorphism, and at worst, through forms of anthropocentrism that construct human kinship as the only valid form of kinship. And there are examples of this throughout the book. There's a little clip of it. I was going to embed a YouTube clip because it's not very long, but then I thought better, against it. So, but you can hear it on YouTube. If you Google it, you can, it summarises the whole book very simply. So on the third page of the story, we're told that children and their parents aren't the only families in the zoo. The animals make families of their own. There are red panda bear families with mothers and fathers and furry red panda bear cubs. There are monkey dads and monkey moms raising noisy monkey babies. There are toad families and toucan families and cotton-top tamarin families too. So in this account, human children and their parents are left unmarked as such, with only non-human animals marked by the designation animal. Yet quickly, this implicit distinction between the human and the non-human families disappears, and we're told that the penguin colony, every year, the penguins pair off into boy and girl couples. So the concern here is not about the genitalia of the penguins, nor is it about the practice of pairing. Rather, it's how the language of boys, girls and coupling brings with it human practice of pairing and a human understanding of these particular terms. And Roy and Silo are positioned as the point of difference to the norm of boy and girl and couples, which again fails to explore whether specifically gendered, i.e. male and female kinship patterns are the norm in penguin colonies, or whether penguin colonies exhibit a more diverse range of kinship patterns, in which case Roy and Silo would not be the point of difference. Now, as the story progresses, the same issues around anthropomorphism and normalising continue, such as in reference to mama and papa penguins, and in the suggestion that Roy and Silo have to learn about nesting from the other penguins. So the language used treats humans' categories as equally legitimate for penguins, just as the language of difference positions Roy and Silo as having to learn about nesting. So it's the human idea that gay men are not natural parents, essentially. They have to learn how to do it. They don't automatically know how to raise children. When the eggs finally hatch, the book reports that Mr. Gramsey, the penguin keeper, says, "We'll call her Tango because it takes two to make a tango," before going on to state that Tango was the very first penguin in the zoo to have two daddies. So this anthropomorphic account of the birth of a child to two daddies is reliant on the disappearance of two other penguins, the penguin who fertilised the egg and the penguin who laid the egg. And in a coda to the story, we're told that the book is based on events that are true, specifically that the egg from which Tango hatched came from a penguin couple named Betty and Porky, who were unable to care for more than one egg at a time. When Betty laid two eggs, one was given to Roy and Silo. Although on the one hand, it would potentially be a form of anthropomorphism for us to insist that Betty and Porky were Tango's birth parents, on the other hand, it's nonetheless important to highlight the fact that given the anthropomorphism that structures the story itself, the claim that it only takes two to make a tango is arguably incorrect. So the focus here on Tango Makes Three gives a glimpse as to the broader argument, which, the intention here is in focusing on this is that when we account for the lives of other species, potentially it tells us a lot more about our own species than it does about the species that we are describing. And we've seen that you see this in lots of other contexts. So zoologists will say it's a capital sin to anthropomorphise other species. And if we watch a natural history programme, it creeps in hugely, especially in mating scenes through the narration and the music associated with that. So there's no escape really. So thinking about human kinship through a post-humanist focus on assemblage then requires us to bring together people and bodies and experiences that may typically considered to be incongruent. More specifically, it requires us to consider how binaries such as culture, nature, woman-man, animal-human, familiar-strange function to construct as much as they function to exclude. In other words, when the strange is rendered familiar, when difference can be incorporated into a logic of sameness, as was the case in King and Family, we must ask what disappears. And the answer to this question from the perspective of a critical kinship studies is the humanistic logic that frames processes of incorporation and naturalisation, processes that we must attend to in order to develop other accounts of kinship. And I promised a bit on Brexit. So humour, I think, is very important in dark times. So this is off my Facebook feed from last weekend. So you may or may not know, but apparently if Britain does crash out of the European Union, we've only got enough toilet roll to last for a day because we import it. So off we trotted to the local supermarket and we stockpiled toilet roll. And, you know, again, humour in dark times, I put it out there and got some interesting, you know, comedy comments from people that I know. But seriously, it is interesting, I think, to think about, you know, where do the boundaries of kinship start and end? And Suzanne yesterday drew our attention to the economic dimension of kinship. And when we think about Butler's kinship practices, when she says fundamental forms of human dependency which may include birth, child rearing, relations of emotional dependency and support, intergenerational ties, illness, dying and death, to name a few, does kinship include a community of people across nationalities? I know I've never felt more European than this moment now, on the eve of potentially not being anymore. And you know, and it's interesting. I mean, Margaret's talk yesterday focused a bit on kind of internet-mediated kinship practices, and again, you know, this is about, you know, Brexit and a potentially fractured kinship, but that's played out within a social media kind of framework. And if I'd have had the opportunity, alas, I didn't get this is absolute gold. I can't play it to you, but it's basically an Australian Broadcasting Corporation spoof on Brexit yogurt. So Google it and watch it. It's about a 3-minute watch and it's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And again, you know, humour in dark times is very, very important. So just to kind of pull these threads together, critical kinship studies takes as its central focus the need to move beyond a humanistic account of kinship. One in which humans' understandings of kinship and human kinship practices are treated as not the only form of kinship and the only ways of being possible. So what we're not suggesting is that kinship studies should be reduced to kind of a naive form of animal studies. That's not what we're suggesting at all. Instead, we're following people like Donna Haraway and others in that there's a twofold element to critical kinship studies. One is to examine which humans are central to understandings of human kinship and through which practices those understandings are developed and how those boundaries are drawn in terms of what constitutes human kinship. And the second is to examine how understandings of human kinship are always already defined in relation to other species. So in terms of a take-home message, I hope I've illustrated some of the ways in which kinship is culture, but also how kinship is discursive practice. In bringing together complex and seemingly competing assemblages of people, personhood and kinship, I hope I've illustrated how a post-humanist approach to critical kinship studies could be achieved. Moreover, this allows us to consider how the narrative contained in stories like King and Family become intelligible. Thinking about these types of stories as human stories of kinship, shaped by a very specific Western humanistic logic of personhood, enables us to think about the connections that both engender and prohibit, the ways of being that render intelligible, and the exclusions that they're reliant upon. I hope to have provided an understanding about what we think is critical about critical kinship studies, and specifically following Poir, asking not what kinship is per se, but rather what it does, what hierarchies, inequalities and ways of being does it prop up, and through what multiple and nebulous assemblages does this occur. Thank you.